because at the point of fertilization between the sperm and the egg, for reasons unknown, the mitochondrial DNA in the sperm disintegrates, leaving only the DNA from the mother and the mother alone. And that is passed on to the mitochondria, and therefore mitochondrial DNA is single-stranded. Well, from the point of view of a molecular biologist, this is actually a kind of a happy event, because it means that you can examine this single-stranded DNA and it doesn't get complicated because there's only one of it instead of two. It doesn't recombine, it doesn't share genes with the other DNA, with the other strand of DNA, so it's very simple to analyze it. Okay, what can we say about this single-stranded mitochondrial DNA that comes from the mother alone? And by the way, when you are analyzing mitochondrial DNA, you are analyzing your maternal inheritance, and that's it. All you can say when you look at a mitochondrial DNA is that you are looking at your mother's line and your mother's line alone, because there is no paternal mitochondrial DNA. Well, there are several interesting characteristics about the single-stranded mitochondrial DNA. One, it mutates, that is, changes at a rate of 2 to 4% per 1 million years. Over a million years, under normal circumstances, up to somewhere between 2 and 4% of that mitochondrial DNA will undergo mutations or changes. And they can be measured. They can be pinpointed and measured. So, that being the case, the fact that it comes from the maternal line alone, and it mutates at a known rate, Rebecca Cann took the mitochondrial DNA from 125 different individuals representing 5 different populations around the world, including the 3 major races. And she reasoned this way. Okay, you look at mitochondrial DNA. You look at the parts of the DNA that have undergone mutation, the mutational prints. Since it occurs at a rate of 2 to 4% per million years, the mitochondrial DNA that has the most changes has to be the oldest. Makes sense, right? If it's been around the longest, it will have changed the most. And you will know within a certain range when those changes occurred. She looked at these specimens from 125 individuals, and she found that the oldest mitochondrial DNA, by virtue of its variability, that virtue of the number of changes on the mitochondrial DNA, was in, first of all, the African group, and in particular the people we call the Bushmen, more properly called the Khoisan people, who now live mainly in the Kalahari Desert, in Botswana and also Namibia. She was able to say that these represent the oldest people on this planet, the remnants of the first human beings, because their mitochondrial DNA is the oldest. Not only that, looking at this mitochondrial DNA and counting the changes, she is able to say how long this mitochondrial DNA has been around in the human gene pool. It has been around in the human gene pool for nearly somewhere between 200 and 300,000 years. So she was able to say that the first modern human being that is Homo sapiens sapiens, appeared in Africa, and it had to have been a woman, at least from the point of view of our analysis, because mitochondrial DNA is only female, right? And she is saying that the first ancestor of modern human beings that we can pinpoint, you know, there might be other ancestors, but this is the only one that we can pinpoint. The only one that we can pinpoint was a female who lived in East Africa somewhere between 200 and 300,000 years ago. She is the first ancestor of all 5.5 billion people that live on this planet. And therefore, Cann gave her the name, quote-unquote, Eve. 2 lines of evidence: fossils, molecular biology. So that even modern human beings, all modern human beings, all 5 billion people on this planet are descended from an black African female who lived in East Africa 200 to 300,000 years ago. This is the conclusion of science. This is not my personal opinion. I didn't do the research. This is the inescapable conclusion of the science of molecular biology, buttressed by the fossil paleontological evidence. So therefore, as one of the molecular biologists says, well, we're all Africans under the skin, no matter who we are. And that is absolutely the truth. That's just a natural fact of it. Don't have to get into whether we want it to be that way or don't want it to be that way. That is the way it is. Okay. Now, all human beings, therefore, from first to last, evolved in Africa. From 4 million years ago all the way down to 200,000 years ago. By definition, pigmented, that is dark brown or black. Had to have been, couldn't have been anywhere else. Otherwise, they would not have survived. We are now left with trying to account for the evolution or the appearance of the various races or branches of humankind that came out of this root and trunk that emerges from Africa. Now, in order to understand this, you have to realize that there was a pretty significant ice age that affected the globe between 2 million years ago and 10,000 years ago. Now, this ice age had a way of kind of ebbing and flowing, kind of going back and forth, kind of moving forward and moving back. And that is really significant for our next demonstration. Human beings appeared in Africa probably not later than 200,000 years ago. They probably don't start migrating significantly out of Africa until after 120,000 years ago. They couldn't migrate into Europe very well because Europe was in the grips of an ice age all the way down to 120,000 years ago when there was a temporary retreat of the ice. And by the way, when the ice age or the glacial period occurs to its maximal extent, a sheet of ice a mile thick comes down and encompasses most of North America and 2/3 of Europe and good large portions of Asia. It even affects Africa and southern areas in Asia in the mountains. Not on the plains, not where it's warm, but in the mountains you have these glaciers during the ice age, when the ice age becomes to its maximal extent. So there would not have been any significant penetration into Europe before 120,000 years ago. When the first human beings began to migrate out of Africa, they would have migrated to what we call the Isthmus of Suez, or they may have even migrated through Arabia. People don't realize Arabia is really part of Africa. You talk about tectonic plates and things moving and stretching. Arabia is geologically is Africa. It used to be a part of African soil until the continental movement separated the two. The Rift Valley formed, and the Red Sea came in and filled up that separation between Africa, what became Africa and Arabia. So just like we talk about Eurasia, we can also talk about Afro-Arabia and still be absolutely true. So they could have either gone to what is called the Isthmus of Suez, or they could have actually gone at that point between Ethiopia and the Arabian Peninsula, which at that time was a land bridge. They would have first gone through southern latitudes into Asia because those were the only latitudes warm enough to sustain human habitation. Which is why, if you go to Syria, Lebanon, India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Vietnam, Burma, Malaysia, China, and you want to find who are the first people who are there, they are invariably black, Africoid, quote, Negrito, unquote, people. Their remnants are still in those areas. Who are the first Asians? The first Asians are people who we would today call black, African, or Negrito. People don't really understand that. They think Asia, Mongoloid, Europe, Caucasoid, Africa, Africoid, or Negroid. That might be true today, but we're talking about a time when the entire population of the globe came out of Africa and by definition was black. And when it moved into the rest of the globe, it stayed black, at least until later on. So that the first inhabitants of all those continents were Africans. Had to be. Couldn't have been anything else. Where else would they come from? They didn't come from outer space. They didn't come from down into the ocean. They couldn't have come from anywhere else but Africa. Now, let's talk about what happened in the appearance of the various races. We talked about how the glacier period ebbs and flows. One such relative retreat of the glacial period, providing somewhat temperate climates in Europe in particular, occurred about 50,000 years ago. That allowed people, Africoid, Negroid, Negrito, whatever term you want to use, to move into Europe, which they did. And I'll show you pictures of these first Europeans a little bit later on. Because they were allowed, it was a temperate enough climate for them to survive. And they stayed there they probably percolated into there from between 50,000 and 40,000 years. But something drastic happened about 40,000 years ago. There was a renewed onset of the Ice Age. All of a sudden, what had been a relatively temperate, warmish climate became an Arctic climate almost overnight. All of a sudden, it was cold, icy, snowy, overcast for months on end. Now, this creates a tremendous problem, and let's talk about that problem right now. The skin has a number of different functions. People don't realize the skin is an organ, just like your heart, just like your brain, just like your lungs and kidneys. The skin is an organ, and it just doesn't just sit there and cover your bones. It functions. It has functions. The melanin in the skin protects the skin against ultraviolet light. If you don't have melanin, what melanin does in the skin is that it absorbs the free radicals of ultraviolet radiation and basically absorbs them and renders them harmless. This is the reason why dark-complected, heavily pigmented people can spend all their lives out in the sun and never get skin cancer, which they do. But the skin also has another function. It is the body's main producer of vitamin D. Now, what is the significance of vitamin D? Vitamin D is absolutely necessary for the proper mineralization of the bones. If you have deficiencies in vitamin D, you will develop either rickets or osteomalacia, which will cause the bones to either crack or bend. It is particularly devastating for women because it distorts the pelvic architecture, and then women can't push babies out of the pelvic inlet. So, rickets is a potentially very devastating consequence of lack of vitamin D production. How is vitamin D produced? It is produced in interaction of the ultraviolet light with the skin. Now, one thing that melanin does, it not only protects against ultraviolet light, but it also screens out most of that ultraviolet light that would go to produce vitamin D. Bad news, right? Well, it's not bad news in a tropical or equatorial environment. Why? Because there is so much sun, so much of the time, that enough gets through or past the melanin barrier to produce sufficient vitamin D for the body's needs. So that's the reason why it's very rare to see rickets among Africans, or really any people in the tropics, anywhere. The situation changes dramatically and drastically when you move now into a northern ice age type of climate. All of a sudden, cold, icy, snowy, long periods of darkness, of being overcast. You're wearing animal skins to protect you from the cold. What is happening? You are the original people in this area, right? So you are dark complected, dark brown or black skin. Well, all of a sudden this black skin isn't as much of an advantage as it used to be. You don't have much sun, so you're not threatened by skin cancer as much. And because you now don't see much sun or not exposed to much sun, you have all these skins and things that you have to wear to protect yourself against the cold. You have drastically reduced sunlight available to produce vitamin D. Now that becomes a decisive problem. That becomes an overwhelming problem. And you have to do something. And I say have to do something, not consciously you have to do something, but something has to happen if you are going to survive. 3 things that you can do, or 3 things that can happen. You can move out of that area and move into a warmer climate, which probably happen to a greater or lesser degree. You can eat vitamin D from food, but you have to realize natural vitamin D comes from only one source: fish. northern ocean-going fish. Cod, halibut, mackerel. It's the only place you can get natural vitamin D. The vitamin D that we get comes from, it's actually put into the milk. But that's the reason why people always used to say cod liver oil is so good for you. Well, it was. It was good, it had iron, and it had vitamin D. But we're talking about a people now who are probably 1,000 miles inland in what is now southwestern Russia, right near the glacier line around the 51st parallel north. The glacier runs through encompasses most of England, goes to the glacier line, goes through Germany, Poland, and right through Russia and all the way up to Siberia. How else do you meet this challenge posed by this drastic change in the environment? The only way you can do it now is to, if you don't leave and you don't have access to vitamin D, which you didn't, is to lose your skin pigment. And this is, in fact, what happened. Now, how do you lose your skin pigment? There are 3 ways that I can think of. There are doctors in this room, so they'll know what I'm talking about when I talk about vitiligo. Vitiligo, I think, is an autoimmune disease which causes a pigmented person essentially to lose their pigment. And we've all seen them. They look like pie balls. I mean, I'm not trying to be derogatory, but that's essentially what they look like. You can see them, they have patches of brown skin, and then the rest of it is depigmented. That's called vitiligo. The other, leprosy can do it. You can lose your skin pigment with leprosy. But there's one problem with both of those methods. A person who has vitiligo won't transfer that condition to his or her children. They will come out normally pigmented. Same thing with a leper. You have to account for how a depigmented person can transmit that condition to his or her offspring. There's only one method, only one sort of situation that can allow for that, and that is albinism. Albinism is a genetic condition, a genetic mutation that deprives the body or deprives the skin of the ability to produce melanin. Albinism is probably most frequently among African populations. You see albinos in Africa even today. It is a mutation, and again, as I said, in Africa, albinos are in a terrible situation, and most of them die young. And of course, we see them among African populations in this country. Now, there are several types of albinism. We only need to focus on 2. One is called tyrosinase negative, and the other is called tyrosinase positive albinism. Tyrosinase negative albinism means that there is absolutely no ability for the skin to produce any melanin whatsoever. The skin cannot tan. The hair, when you are born, remains a stark yellowish white. The skin remains a stark white all of your life. Tyrosinase positive albinism, if you will, however, is an incomplete albinism. There is some small residual ability to tan. They will get in the sun and they will tan a little bit, unlike tyrosinase negative. There is a subset, if you will, or a subtype of tyrosinase positive albinism called albinoidism. Again, it is an incomplete or partial albinism which allows the skin to tan a little bit. And albinoids, wherever you find them, have a range of eye colors from hazel to green to blue, and they also have a range of hair colors. And by the way, just as an aside, the gene that produces skin, there are 4 genes that affect skin color. So in other words, mutations in any one of these 4 can cause, as I say, an incomplete or partial albinoidism. An albinoid, a black African albinoid, has skin colors that are very much the same as what you would see in Europe today, anywhere from the Mediterranean all the way up to the Baltic, up to Scandinavia. European albinoids, well, there's something else I wanted to, one of the points that I want to make about that, yeah. Europeans who have a really pure albinism do not, in effect, suffer from any of the devastating effects of that tyrosinase negative albinism, because they do not have the exposure to the sun that occurs in Africa. So they can live out normal lifespans, and some of them are hard to distinguish from the normal European population. So, What was it? Those who remained, that Africoid population that remained in southwestern Russia after 40,000 BC or BPE, had to have been a group of albinoids who, by the loss of their skin pigment, actually were better adapted to the cold Arctic environment imposed by the Ice Age. The other thing about white skin or depigmented skin is that it is more cold resistant. How do we know this? In World War II and the Korean War, they found that black soldiers were 3 to 5 times more likely to get frostbite than white soldiers. And they actually tested this in the laboratory and found out that yes, white skin resists cold better than black skin. Not only that, but blacks in the northern hemisphere are 3 times more likely to get rickets than whites. Because why? Because they have found that white skin is better at extracting ultraviolet light to produce vitamin D because it doesn't have melanin in it, so there's no barrier. So those who remained, by definition, had to have been albinoids. Now the other thing that happened is that this group was a relatively small, isolated group. And you see, the thing about albinism in any of its form is that it is a recessive condition. The only way in which it can perpetuate itself frequently is that there has to be a certain amount of inbreeding within the group. Even in Africa, those populations where you find a lot of African albinos are populations in Africa that have a fair amount of inbreeding. So here you have this small marginal population in Russia, isolated to a large extent, inbreeding to a large extent. The recessive albinoid genes are cropping up more frequently, but in this case it's actually an advantage because it allows them greater production of vitamin D and greater protection against the cold. So they will be, if you will, environmentally more suited to this kind of climate. And over a period of 10 to 20,000 years, they will replace altogether their darker skinned relatives who are there. And this is in fact what happened. And you find this, by the way, throughout evolutionary history. Insects, animals, and plants. Evolutionary change is most rapid among small, isolated, peripheral populations who have undergone a rapid change in climate or environment. Usually, rapid change in climate or environment. Now, there were some other adaptations that occurred. We talked about how among blacks in Africa, original human beings in Africa, temperature regulation and heat dissipation was the most important problem. Other adaptations that enhanced this were development of a broad flaring nostril. Why? Because by the way, I might add, you lose 85% of your heat from your head and neck. You also lose a lot of moisture through respiration, through breathing in and out. What does a broad flaring nostril do? Well, it again it enhances the movement of air in a hot environment, and therefore enhances the loss of moisture and therefore the loss of heat. What do thick, everted, full lips do? They increase your surface area of your face. You increase the surface area of your face, again, there's going to be more heat loss. What does kinky, woolly hair do? Particularly among the people called the Khoisan who have what they call peppercorn hair. Well, what it does is that, particularly peppercorn hair, it exposes more of the scalp to the environment and allows more of the heat to escape from the head. 85% of your heat escapes from the head. So the hair type, the nose type, and the lips type enhance heat loss. Well, it's exactly the opposite now in an ice age environment in Europe. What does a narrow nostrils do? It helps retain heat. It helps prevent the loss of heat through the nostrils. What do thin lips do? Again, reduce surface area of the face, and again, reduce loss of heat. What does straight hair do? It lays down on the back of the shoulders, and again, prevents loss of heat from the head and neck. And by the way, that adaptation may have occurred even before, that may have not necessarily been an adaptation that occurred in Europe, because you do find straight-haired type among Africoids, and these are very old. You apparently had 2 different types of Africoid people early in prehistory. The woolly hair type and the straight hair type. So if you will, there was, if you will, a precursor to the straight hair that you find characteristic among the Caucasoids. So this explains, or this accounts for how the Caucasoids could have come into being out of the people that had migrated into Europe from Africa. This accounts for one branch of the human family, and what we might say therefore is that the Caucasoid branch of the human family was better adapted to the Ice Age climate of Europe between 40,000 and 25,000 years ago. The Cro-Magnon, the Cro-Magnons, what we call the Cro-Magnons, are probably the first people who we would call Caucasoid. They make their appearance between 30 and 25,000 years ago. So this was a very rapid sequence of events. Now, let's move over to Asia. Remember what we said. The peoples who first inhabited Asia were people who today we would call the Khoisan or Bushmen or the Twa and the Pygmy types. I use those words even though they're a little derogatory because at least people know what I'm talking about, even though Bushmen are really Khoisan, Pygmies are really Twa. The Khoisan or Bushman people are particularly interesting. They are small in stature. They tend to have a yellowish-brown skin, and they tend to have epicanthal folds over their eyes. And we know that there were groups of them who had lived in South and what is now Southeast Asia at a very early time. In this period when there was a relative retreat of the Ice Age, certain of them would have migrated into what is Siberia. With the renewal of the Ice Age, the same set of forces that produced the Caucasian on the western end of the Eurasian continent also conspired to produce what we call the Mongoloid, with a couple of small minor differences. Well, differences. For one thing, the thing that what we call the Mongoloid had to contend with, more so than in Europe, was the constant wind of the steppes, or Siberia. It's a very windy place. Wind is constant. So, what do? A stocky body, which is characteristic of the Mongoloids, again would help retain heat. Thin body loses heat. A stocky body retains heat. We said that the Khoisan, or Bushman people, have what we call epicanthal fold. In Siberia, the early Khoisan types, that epicanthal fold will become accentuated because what does it do? It protects the eyes against the constant wind of the steppes and also warms, if you will, the air moving around the face. Even the flatness of the face tends to be something that is adapted not only to cold but also to wind. There would have been some genetic intermixture between the eastern and western halves of the continent. So there would have been some Caucasian, if you will, genes that would have modified the Mongolian type and perhaps accounted for his dark and straight hair. But what is also clear, interestingly enough, is that from time to time there were Southeastern Asian Africoid types that continued to migrate up and continue to contribute to the gene pool. By the way, there is evidence in the Viking saga that there were groups of small blacks who lived in what is now Sweden and Scandinavia all the way up until 1,000 years ago. Now, how come these groups of small blacks didn't die out? Well, where are they? They're in Scandinavia. They're in the North Atlantic. They have access to northern ocean-going fish. Therefore, they have access to vitamin D. Therefore, they do not have the environmental pressures on them created by living inland 1,000 miles. So there were small pockets of them that were able to persist in Europe all the way up into the historical period until just 1,000 years ago. You found them in parts of the British Isles, Scandinavia, even Iceland. It all fits once you work it out that way. It makes sense if you think about it logically. You work back from what is the reality and create a plausible, or attempt to create a plausible explanation for how the things happened that did happen. There, I think we come, essentially now to the crux or to the conclusion of this part of our presentation, showing you, one, how humanity originated in Africa, underwent its primary evolution for 4 million years in Africa and Africa alone, how migrations allowed the original people out of Africa to literally populate the globe, and how the different races or branches of mankind devolved, or these varieties evolved out of this original African type as a response to climactic changes, profound climactic changes that occurred. As I said, all human beings belong to the same species. That means any human being from any part of the globe can mate with an opposite sex from another part of the globe and still be part and still produce fertile offspring. If you will, these adaptations allowed human beings to inhabit habitats that they otherwise would not have been able to move into. And this is essentially what evolution does. This is essentially what evolution does and natural selection does. It modifies the physical organism enough to allow the organism, whether it be plant, animal, or human, to inhabit a new environment that otherwise would be closed off to it. What we're going to do now is go to the slides, which will take about 10 or 15 minutes, so we can illustrate some of the points that we've made up to this point. Okay, yes. Unfortunately, I think a lot of this is going to be a little fuzzy to those in the back. But if you can't see, just try to arrange yourself so that you have a better view. This just shows you the original supercontinent that contained all of the Earth's landmass 65 million years ago. And you see here, South America here's Africa, South America was attached to it, India was attached to it, Australia, Antarctica was attached to it, Australia was attached to it, and Arabia. You see, and then when the Rift Valley formed, it created the Red Sea, and the Africa and Arabia split apart. Actually, you know, Africa, these changes are still going on. Give us another 10 million years, and the entire section of East Africa will actually separate off from the rest of Africa. It's still going on. I think it's supposed to be, Africa is still separating at a rate of several centimeters a year. Give it 10 million years, and there will actually be an ocean between what is now Kenya, Tanzania, and say the Congo. Can we have the next slide, please? Good. Oh, we did? Can you go back a little bit? If you can't, we can stay with this. Okay, let's just go back. Let's just keep going. Okay. Okay, now go forward again. Okay. You want to move it over just a little bit? The slide. Okay, this is, if you will, a tree of human ancestry. Okay? There are 3 branches of this tree that begin from Australopithecus afarensis. You can see it way over here. 2 branches of this tree go on to give you the other Australopithecine species, Africanus, Robustus, borzii, are all species that belong to Australopithecus genus. They represent dead ends in human evolution. Wait, I'm not finished, Oh, okay. This is the line, however, that leads to human. Is it on automatic or something?
Yeah.
Okay, let's take it off automatic.